The Auburn Dam, as envisioned in an early artist's drawing in 1965. A thin-arched concrete structure, it would be immense, with a length of 3/4 of a mile and nearly 70 stories tall, the largest such dam in the world, large enough to hold back the north and middle forks of the American River east of Sacramento, California. It would be an immense thing to behold, an engineer's dream project, the kind of project careers could be built upon. Aesthetics aside, it had everything going for it. Approval from Congress, political support up and down the line, buy-in from the agency that would build it, and enthusiastic local residents anxious to begin construction. If ever a project was ready to go, Auburn Dam was it. Yet it was never built. Instead of disappearing into a lake, the American River today continues to flow peacefully in its canyon, just as it has done for millions of years. But if it was never built, why not? To bring you the story, we dug deep, exploring archives, uncovering documents, and interviewing people who were there at the time. Many have since passed on, but you'll see them expose a misleading tale told by the dam proponents to sell the project to an increasingly skeptical public. We won't follow a sequential timeline, but we will focus on the themes that were critical to the story. We'll show the steps they took, the advertising campaigns, desperate at times, to keep the project alive. We'll show how the controversy reached national dimensions. But at the end of a long struggle, which in some ways continues to this day, Auburn Dam remains the only major dam ever approved in the United States that was not built. To set the stage, let's tell you about Sacramento, California's capital. It's located at the confluence of two rivers, the Sacramento and the American, both of which are prone to flood. Gary Estes, founder of the California Extreme Precipitation Symposium, explains what that means.
Atmospheric rivers is a generic term that was given to this phenomenon, which actually we see in both the northern and southern hemispheres. And atmospheric rivers moves water vapor around the planet, and that's what causes rain. When you look at the clouds outside, every cloud is full of water vapor, and there it sits suspended in the air, and then at some point some of the water vapor condenses and falls from the sky as rain or snow.
The floods are legendary. The big one, ingrained in the city's memory, inundated Sacramento in January 1862. After the flood, the quaintly named Swampland Commission concluded that there were only a few modes, as they called them, to prevent another city drowning flood. One was to build levees to contain the river, and the other one was, in their words, by providing reservoirs in which to contain the waters of overflow. 50 years later, studies by engineers Grunsky and Given analyzed the effect of floods on Sacramento. Improvements to the levees protected Sacramento, but nearly 100 years passed before the government looked at a more reliable solution, a dam. In 1947, an interagency meeting was held to address how big of a dam to build. All hands were on deck: the California Water Resources Division, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers representing the War Department, and the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, all called together by California Governor Earl Warren. When the chairman announced no journalists were allowed in the meeting, he set the tone the government would take for the next 40 years. All internal discussions were to be kept secret. The public would only be told what the dam builders wanted them to hear. The participants considered 3 locations and agreed to pursue a dam on the American River in the town of Folsom. Folsom Dam was built, filling in 1955. But even as it filled, behind the scene, agencies were planning another dam. The political wheels turned in Washington, and legislation was passed authorizing the Auburn Dam. The journey to get the dam approved is an interesting and instructive story. Let's take a look back. Dam advocates knew local support for the dam was essential. The committee turned to William Bill Cassidy, publisher and editor of the Auburn Journal newspaper, to lead the charge. He agreed, accepting $35,000 a year for his effort. In today's dollars, that's $350,000. The upcoming publicity campaign would be even more expensive, so he appealed to local agencies for contributions. Their public stance would be the dam was for water storage, recreation, and power generation. But in other communications, like this letter to the chairman of the Sacramento Board of Supervisors, he stressed that the real reason was flood control. Why conceal the truth from the public? Because one of the purposes of the Folsom Dam, completed only a few years before, had also been flood control. And in this brochure, they assured the public that Folsom Dam had saved Sacramento from flooding. The claim was a critical mistake, and it would haunt them. How could you demand hundreds of millions of dollars for the Auburn Dam to fix a problem you claim to have already fixed only 10 years before? The deception continued. In this brochure mailed to local residents, the reasons to build the dam were recreation, power, water, and, rather ludicrously, ecology and fish and game. Nowhere was flood control mentioned. The dam had been authorized, but not yet funded by Congress. BOR officials were optimistic, even though the Vietnam War had created a budget deficit. Local businesses and unions were enthusiastically on board, sensing the money would soon begin flowing. Developers laid out the proposed shoreline, sparking a land rush for waterfront lots. Reclamation had built dozens of big dams in the West without opposition, and they took it for granted there would always be local support. But the times were changing. People were questioning authority. Dan Walters is a journalist who has covered California politics for 40 years.
Well, the 1970s in California, I think historians will someday look back on that as one of the kind of key epochs of change in California, where the whole state was undergoing massive social, economic, demographic, and cultural change. And one of the aspects of that change was that the kind of golden era of public works in California that had begun, probably during the latter years of the Depression, came to an end. And Auburn Dam got caught up in that kind of change of mood, I guess, or kind of maybe had something to do with Watergate or Vietnam, the kind of the loss of faith in government and government projects and that sort of thing. But up until that point, California had been go-go on public works, extensive highway network, dams, reservoirs, canals, water systems, all sorts of things, as well as university campuses and everything. There had been a great expansion in that, particularly after World War II, as California's population grew very dramatically. But it came to almost a screeching halt in the late 1970s and the early 80s. Projects that had been in some cases in the works for years and years and years, highway projects, for example, and dams and water projects, the peripheral canal that was supposed to carry water around the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. They all ran up against a wall of suspicion, of newfound environmental consciousness, finances in some case. And so this era just kind of came to a screeching halt during that period, and the Auburn Dam was caught up in that.
In a period of only 5 years, 7 state and federal acts were passed to protect the environment. They had the power of law. While there had been opposition to the Glen Canyon Dam in the 1950s by a nascent environmental movement, the Bureau had brushed it aside and built the dam. Now they realized that for the first time, one of their projects could be challenged in court. Cassidy reached out to the Pacific Legal Foundation, a law group recently formed by lawyers from the Reagan administration. Their specialty was to represent private property interests in environmental lawsuits. They were glad to take the case on, they said, though they warned they would have to put their best people on it, and it would be expensive. Environmental groups sued to stop the dam. Case 2663, filed in the Federal Eastern District Court of California, claimed its Environmental Impact Statement, EIS, was inadequate. The judge agreed and ordered a satisfactory EIS to be produced. In an interesting aside, Judge McBride noticed a mystifying, inadequate discussion regarding the Folsom Dam. Hadn't it been built to stop a Sacramento flood? If so, why was the new dam necessary? If the project was built as planned, there wouldn't be enough water to fill a reservoir, provide water to agriculture, and provide habitat for the fish. If you envisioned the project as a stool with 3 legs, recreation, power, and water, the water leg had just been knocked off. With it went the support of the agricultural industry. While the Bureau, the Pacific Legal Foundation, and the Auburn Dam Committee scrambled to circumvent the decision, another inconvenient truth emerged. On June 13, 1967, Reclamation's Regional Director, Robert Pafford, Jr., had an unpleasant task. In a speech to the El Dorado County Chamber of Commerce, he had to inform local residents that there would be no waterfront homes on Auburn Reservoir. The canyon walls would be too steep and the water level would fluctuate too much. Instead, there would be a red clay bathtub ring around the water. The best he could promise the locals was a distant view overlooking a beautiful lake.
We're rolling, and you're going to tell us about people who might have bought property when they thought the dam was going to be built and what happened to them.
We had friends that purchased property in Cool and expected waterfront property and didn't get it. And now they are underwater in their house, but don't have a waterfront property. But we really enjoy this. This is our favorite place to come here at Upper Lake Clementine. We bring family always when they're visiting. It's our favorite place to play in the water.
A milestone in the project was the construction of a highway bridge over the north branch of the river. It was funded and built to a height over 700 feet above the river bed, tall enough to clear the final water level. The dedication ceremony, organized by Auburn Journal's Cassidy, was an exercise in showmanship, featuring a donkey and an elephant to symbolize united support. It remains to this day the tallest bridge in the state, hanging alone in the sky. Insiders understand the inherent danger of dams, but the understanding of the general public is limited by press releases from the government downplaying the dangers. A case in point, we visited Oroville on February 12, 2017. It was a pleasant early spring day, and the residents were strolling along the levee, enjoying the weather and looking at an unusually large discharge from Oroville Dam. Our purpose was to see what Oroville residents would advise Auburn residents contemplating a dam of their own. Some were cautious in their recommendation, but most were happy with their dam.
And the benefits from a nice size dam would probably contribute to a nice lake for recreation and fishing, and those are some of the positive things that I'm thinking you guys could look forward to.
In Auburn.
Oh, I think it'd be great. Save more water during the drought and ease this up a little bit from the other dams.
Although they're reassuring us that the dam was well built and will hold the water back, but there's unforeseen consequences sometimes.
That very day, after we packed up our gear, all hell broke loose. Sirens began wailing, emergency vehicles filled the streets, and a general evacuation of Oroville was ordered, as the authorities warned of the imminent collapse of Oroville Dam. It was a shocking event. Nearly 180,000 people flew to safety that night, jamming the highways for miles.
Center open at Glenn County Fairgrounds. This is on 221 East Yolo Street in Orland. So you're looking right here on your screen of the areas that are affected by this right now. It is a wide area, not only the
needs assistance, call 211 for assistance, and keep the 911 lines clear if you can. As you take a look at the inundation map, if you will, there you see the Oroville Dam to the upper right-hand portion of your screen, and then all of that area to the left of it.
Another near-run thing, and another shock to the public consciousness. The Auburn project had been under fire on environmental and cost issues from the beginning, and now another issue was raised: safety. Dams are subject to failure at a surprising degree. The giant Oroville Dam had caused an inundation-induced earthquake when it was filled and almost collapsed in 2017, and the Teton Dam had completely collapsed while being filled for the first time in 1976. This rarely seen graphic is an inundation map showing the extent of the flood should the Auburn Dam fail. Within hours of a collapse, the state capitol would be under 30 feet of water. What could cause such a collapse? Most likely an earthquake. And Reclamation's own documentation placed the odds of such an earthquake occurring over the life of the dam at 30%. Earthquakes occur on faults. Government geologists minimized the risk, but their own graphic showed several faults converging at the dam site. The Spenceville Fault, Maidu Fault, Wolf Creek Fault, and the ominously named Dead Man Fault. Rapid filling of a reservoir adds to the danger by exerting new pressure on the faults. Two teams of geologists evaluated the risk and submitted a report. One team found the risk to be minimal. They discounted a slip on a fault near the proposed site that offset the ground about 3 feet. One team claimed that it had occurred as a series of small, harmless slips over a long period of time, which was the conclusion the government adopted. But the second team's conclusion was that the slip occurred at one time, caused by an earthquake which would certainly endanger a dam. Dave Harwood was one of the dissenting geologists who risked their career by siding with the evidence. We brought him back to the dam site 40 years later to see if he had changed his mind.
Every now and then there is a trench that provides excellent data. And one of those occurred a few miles north of here, near just in the city of Auburn. And Woodward Clyde opened that trench, and we did look at it. And in that trench there was a fracture in the bedrock fault and a shear zone in the bedrock, and the fault continued into the alluvium, and within the alluvium there was at one time on top of the bedrock, or within the alluvium, not right on top of the bedrock, there was a layer of soil, paleosol, that an older soil that had formed when that was the erosion surface exposed to the air. The soil formed, it got buried by more alluvium, then the fault offset that bed of paleosol, and in this trench it offset it about 36 inches. And the important thing about the trench was, or the offset of that paleosol, was that it was one straight, clean break. Often when
In 1986, the safety issue surfaced again. That spring, there had been an extreme weather event, another atmospheric river. As the rain fell, the upstream cofferdam, a temporary structure which held back the river from the construction area, suddenly collapsed. Folsom Dam failed to contain the ensuing flood, and the downstream levees came within inches of overtopping. The question was raised then, and still resonates today. Why was Folsom, the dam that saved Sacramento, unable to contain the flood? Ron Stork is a senior policy advocate with the Friends of the River.
In 1986, weather forecasters, they had satellites in 1986. We're forecasting a very large event to land in Northern California, and DWR's people were put on full alert, and Reclamation's people knew it was coming. Reclamation, as the storm landed and the reservoir started rising, they decided to not follow the reservoir regulation manual that requires them to make releases, flood releases, when the flood control space is encroached. And that meant that they were always behind.
Why would they decide not to make flood releases?
One can speculate.
Phil Williams was an expert witness in case 2663. He also puzzled over the Bureau's lack of action.
But for some reason, releases were not made. Water was being stored in the reservoir when it should have been evacuated. Even though we knew that this was going to be a large flood, they were storing water in Folsom at the time when the city of Napa was flooding. The storm was that intense. So instead of operating the dam prudently, the operator, the Bureau of Reclamation, just sat on its hands and allowed the reservoir to fill. For 36 hours, it was filling when they should have been releasing.
Gary Estes raises the obvious question. Was a lack of action by the dam operator deliberate?
So because of that, the cofferdam was still in place because a project was still in play, very active in the mid-1980s. Then we had the 86 flood, and there are some stories that maybe somebody at Reclamation may have decided to scare Sacramento and wanting to build a project because they understood the cost-share ratio of 65% federal government for flood control projects, and you could get 65% coming from the federal government for a project. So maybe we'll just sit here and let the reservoir just kind of sit here and just scare Sacramento into, gee, we need to go find a solution. And we have what we call water buffaloes. You know, the water community is a small group of consultants and agencies talk to each other on a regular basis at annual conferences. There's the ACWA. ACWA is the California Statewide Water Agency annual conference where people get together and share knowledge about things, and people trying to figure out how do you come up with solutions. So, why did Reclamation sit there for that time? And you look at what the NRC said, that if they had followed the rules, wouldn't have been a problem. So why didn't they? And so why would an agency do that? And they try to say in a report they did, well, we were trying to save the golf course downstream. Well, one of the classic informations about when you build projects in floodplains, in the floodway, is that you put things that you don't mind getting destroyed because you can put them back relatively cheaply. And golf courses and recreational areas is one of those features that you can say, we don't have floods that often, and we can fix it. We can put it back. So they're trying to use that as one of the rationales in the report they did. Well, we're trying to protect the golf course. Wait a minute. If you live in Sacramento but behind the levees, do you care about the golf course, which is in the floodway? In other words, in the floodway means you got two levees, and the golf course is inside the levees. Well, that's the place that's going to flood. And you should design it to flood because someday, guess what? It's going to flood because it has in the past. So it's a very lame excuse from my perspective.
The government released a video of the cofferdam failure. It described in clinical detail what happened, but it failed to address the issue that while the cofferdam was constructed as a temporary structure, intended to remain in place only 3 or 4 years, it had been left in place for 10 years.
A distant view shows the spillway channel erosion. Significant erosion The horseshoe erosion near the left side of the channel continues to move upstream. A substantial quantity of earth is being moved by the large flow of water. As the water eats further into the structure, the pace of the erosion speeds up.
We're running back up towards the top left-hand side of the video. This is the levee along El Camino Avenue, just upstream from the Interstate 80.
It was a near-run thing. Otis Woolen, former director of the Placer County Water Agency, described what could have happened.
That was the cofferdam, which had been built for something like 1 in 33 year flood protection during construction of Auburn Dam. It had been there a number of decades, and this storm simply overtopped it, which sent this huge gush of water down into Sacramento and very nearly overtopped the levees on Folsom. Now, had that gone over the top, they were within inches. If that had gone, basically you would have had a wall of water approximately 40 feet high pushing through the Capitol. And the government's own statistics say that that would have happened within 5 hours. You probably would have lost 750,000 people. There would be no way for people to escape from that.
If the public rationale for the Auburn Dam was a three-legged stool resting on power, recreation, and water, by the 90s, all three legs had been knocked out. Meanwhile, the cost of the project, as the proponents repeatedly raised new design permutations to respond to challenges, skyrocketed. And new obstacles were raised from an unlikely source.
Let's talk about Ronald Reagan and the Auburn Dam. The man in the dam.
I'd be happy to start.
Yes.
I think it's fair to say that Ronald Reagan had more to do with killing Auburn Dam than any other American. And Reagan and his people, when they were governor, carried on the tradition of Pat Brown, the founder of the State Water Project, in a feeling that these water projects needed to pay for themselves, essentially return the money to the taxpayers that the taxpayers had invested in these projects. When Ronald Reagan went to Washington as president, the Bureau of Reclamation was recovering from the challenge that had happened at the Auburn Dam site with the Oroville earthquake. And Reclamation was trying to put together essentially a revised multipurpose Auburn Dam project that they hoped would not break in an earthquake. But Reagan and Reagan's people demanded that the customers of Auburn Dam, the water and power customers of Auburn Dam, pay off the water and power features of Auburn Dam. And the large majority of the project costs had been allocated to those two project areas. Well, this was unheard of. For years and years, the water and power customers of Reclamation's dam projects have been accustomed to large public subsidies. And Reagan and Reagan's people were saying that's ended. And when that happened, that effectively caused Reclamation's project to self-destruct.
Defeating the Auburn Dam didn't mean the flood threat to Sacramento went away. As Judge McBride had noted in his decision, the Folsom Dam had not been designed to contain a standard project flood. California dam operators face a conundrum. They need to store as much water as possible for use in the dry summer months, but they can't allow their reservoirs to fill up too early from the winter storms in case there are spring rainstorms. It's a timing issue and a capacity issue. Hydrologists developed a simple solution for the American River: enlarge the spillway capacity on Folsom Dam. That way, operators could allow the reservoir to fill more completely in the winter, and if there were spring storms, they could release enough water to keep up with the inflows. And that's exactly what they did. The spillway was enlarged, and Sacramento is finally safe from floods. But does that mean the Auburn Dam project is dead? Not quite. The Auburn Dam is a Rasputin of dams. It has been stabbed, shot, poisoned, and drowned, yet it still struggles to stay alive. In 2016, the Auburn Dam Committee was still meeting, and politicians still maintained the faith. The lesson: if someone tries to sell you a dam, remain skeptical. Listen to the voice of Congressman Tom McClintock.
It will be built. The only question is whether it's built before the Sacramento Plain is inundated by a 400-year flood, or sadder but wiser, we build it after that happens.
Eric Peach is the director of Protect American River Canyon, a local citizens group formed in the 1970s to preserve the American River Canyon. He's also an artist and a sculptor. His work surrounds his studio at his home in Auburn. His life, his friends, and his sense of community have been intertwined with the Auburn Dam. Although the dangers of the dam are self-evident now, at the time, things weren't so clear. They were moving too fast as the dam builders scrambled to develop rationales to counter every argument against it. Ultimately, it took the efforts of committed people like Eric to stop the dam and save the American River and its canyon.
Well, the struggle has really brought me closer to this community in a way that I never thought I would experience in my life. I think that the whole Auburn Dam issue and getting to know the river and bring it closer to more into people's lives, it brought me more in touch with the community and the people that live here, because I had to work with these people to get them to understand how important the American River and the canyons were to us as a community. So I think that's probably one of the main things that it opened up for me. I think it's history for a lot of people, and it really doesn't have that much relevance except in more political circles. The community thinks a lot about the river. It's in town now, where it didn't used to be. There's artwork in town that represents the river, where there never used to be. There's beers that are named after the river. It's the river. We've reclaimed our identity as a river city, as a river town. Compared to when I first moved here, everybody was like, "Oh, we're going to be next to this big, fabulous reservoir." But then the reality set in that we were going to be next to a mud hole. So, in that respect, it was really a lot of fun to work with the community and bring in scientists and artists who went out on hikes with us and did presentations in the community, and let them know what we really had here, what we would be missing. The reservoir might be full, but it would be drawn down each year, and that's what I mean by the mud hole. We were going to be the sacrifice area for Folsom, because we had steep canyons. There's not that much recreation that you associate with reservoirs and steep canyons, except for some boating, but that was going to be restricted because of a speed limit on the reservoir. So it wasn't going to be this pretty place that people thought it was going to be. And when you started to think through that a little more thoroughly, and you started to see what we had, it made a lot more sense to try to really bring that more into our lives. Well, so speaking of artwork, here's a combination of an old part of the Auburn Dam and some fish sculptures that I made. So this arch right here was one of the big form bolts that held the forms together when they were pouring concrete for the Auburn Dam. And we cleaned it out of the river because it was a hazard in one of our cleanups. And it had formed almost this perfect arch. And so I made these salmonid fish. They represent trout, steelhead, and salmon as a celebration piece when the river was restored to its natural channel in 2008. So this kind of represents a big change in the whole Auburn Dam struggle, because for years the river was rerouted through a tunnel, and now it's going through its natural channel. So I built this little arch here to celebrate that event.
After decades of turmoil, and then final success, Eric's thoughts returned to the river and his canyon, which were treasures the dam would destroy. Thanks to Eric and people like him, they're safe. The only evidence of the struggle are the scars left on the canyon walls by the bulldozers. So, how do you summarize the saga of the Auburn Dam? Is it a story of legal battles? Of dramatic changes in American environmental consciousness? How about a governor who changed his mind about the project after he was elected president? Is it the story of money running out for an expensive project? Or the discovery of a geologic danger at the dam site? Or is it the story of local citizens committed to saving their river? Maybe it's all of these things. And maybe what is important is not so much the details of the saga, but the reality today that the American River continues to flow peacefully in its canyon, just like it has for millions of years.